Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Here We Are podcast. My name is Shane Mauss. Today, I'm talking with Katharine York. Katharine, tell folks a little bit about yourself. You were a past stand-up science guest.
Yes, that's right. In Manchester, I forget how many months ago. It seems like ages in a way.
It was the what are they calling it now? The before times?
Yeah, no kidding, right? Before the world changed. And that was a lot of fun. So that was in Manchester. I teach at Southern New Hampshire University, where I've been for 10 years. And I am basically just trying to get through all of this like everybody else. Bat season is about to be here, which is good. Of course, nature isn't waiting on any of us. So the work that I'm doing with bats will start up here in another week or so. So that's kind of my life waiting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're a bat researcher.
Yeah, I teach a lot of different things. Most of my courses are general biology. I teach zoology, and I've loved bats for many, many years. So I've been doing little studies around New Hampshire and New England to survey bat populations. As we all know, white nose syndrome is now reaching even farther across the West. So it's pretty important to know kind of what's happening with bat species, and I've been doing that for a number of years now.
So one, I wore a bat shirt for you.
Oh, bats! I love it. That's a great bat shirt.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and so there's that, and then I have I think we should probably do some 101 stuff for folks, because I wouldn't take it for granted that everyone knows what white nose syndrome is. I don't think that I was super familiar until I had you on the show.
All right, that's a good point. I often kind of assume that because so many people these days have actually heard of it, which is good and bad. But the basics of it is this: it is a fungal disease that's affecting bat populations. It has been in the United States since about the winter of 2006. So about 15 years, well, going on 15 years now, 14, 15 years. And before that, it was unknown in the continent of North America. People think that it was brought to this continent by somebody who had been in a cave in Europe and probably got the fungus on himself, brought it over to New York. So the state of New York was the first place that this fungus began to spread. And now, in a real bullseye pattern, you can see this fungus spreading through bat populations to the extent that there's probably around 8 or 9 different species of bats that have lost up to 97% of all of the bats in this region. So the New England region has really been hit hard. In particular, our most common bat, which is called a little brown bat, has been decimated. So there are a lot of studies going on right now to try to see if they're going to come back, are they going to rebound, what kind of things can we do? And I guess if you'd like, I can tell you a little bit about what the disease looks like, or if you have any questions, just interrupt me.
So many. All right. I mean, first of all, this is really interesting because right now humans are worried about the decrease in their population because of something bat related, but it looks like humans have been harder on bats than the other way around.
Yeah, we can definitely talk about that too. There is this sort of rumor that, again, that coronavirus has come from bat populations in Asia and those kind of things. So I know, I'm not an expert on those things, but I can tell you from a bat scientist perspective, kind of
sure.
what I'm thinking about there.
Yeah.
Should I finish up about white nose or then?
Oh, you steer the ship. This is just this is, if you've never heard my it's super conversational.
Okay,
we're just having a chat. Yeah.
The thing about bats is there's so much to say,
Yeah, great. No, you believe me, I will not stop myself from interrupting you at any time with any questions or whatever. Okay. So well, then, whatever you find interesting.
Let me just tell you a little bit about what white nose disease does to bats. First of all,
fantastic.
Because it's been around for a while, it actually forms a little fungal mask on their noses, which is where it got the name white nose syndrome. So it looks like a fuzzy area on their muzzles, and it loves cold and really kind of cold environments. So this fungus is really dangerous in the time when bats hibernate for the winter. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing about it. gets on their noses and it starts to form this little mask. It causes them to wake up early in the year. So around April, early, you know, again, March and April, they begin to itch and scratch and kind of wake up, and it causes them to leave their hibernacula a little bit too early. So they start flying out before there are any insects around, nothing to eat. So they tend to starve, and they undergo a really slow decline and ultimately die. It also causes their wings to get holes in the wings. So many times you'll find bats that are dead just on the ground, that are unable to fly. So
well, wait, the fungus makes the holes in the wings?
It actually causes lesions in the wing. So they'll have, it looks like ravaged wings is the way that you'll see it described, sort of ragged looking.
So there's this like very direct impact that's like physically their way, but then there's also this like sort of a little more nuanced, less direct of like it causes them to go up, which then causes them to starve.
Yes, all those things. So it's a very unfortunate way for them to die, and it spreads very easily through these caves where they're all clustered together in the wintertime to hibernate. So that's kind of the extent of what the fungus will do, and it's caused just huge decimation of all the populations around here, in particular in New England. It's spreading out west now, so it's actually reached Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, this whole line that sort of reaches up through the west. It's even been found in Oregon. So that's some really dangerous indications that it's spreading in those areas. One big place that people are really worried about now is Texas. There's a lot of hibernating bat areas in Texas. So it's spreading still. And so it's a big, big problem. In the Northeast, there's a lot of people like me who go out in the bat season. So we have a lot of bats that go somewhere else to hibernate in the winter and come back in the summertime. So really the only time you see bats is between right about now, early May, and through October. So that's kind of the only window that we have to look for bats, unless you're looking in caves and mines in those areas. So I go out and I count bats and try to see how many of them in the different species there are. Trying to help with, again, that kind of recovery sort of information. So, yeah.
So are there, so am I wrong in thinking that one of the major threats to bats is just things that are more humans going into their cave? So you have minor, I mean, it's amazing that someone was just like, I've been caving myself. It was a really fun activity. I did it once. I plan to potentially do it again. I had never thought like, oh, I could be negatively impacting a bat population or something. It never even occurred to me until this is before I had you on my show. And so are those, is that the main threat to bats right now, is like mining and stuff like that? Or are there other environmental factors of like climate change and other?
There are definitely all those things. So you've got a pretty much kind of the widespread effect of just habitat loss is one major reason that bats are facing a lot of problems, because bats will return to what we call maternity colonies, where all the female bats will come and have their babies, which happens usually early June, around that area. And in this part of the country, there are really big colonies established. When you cut down trees and you lose those habitats, then that's a big way that you can actually decrease species across the board. So that's one big thing, habitat loss. You've got that in conjunction with climate change, just the loss and the change of food sources as we warm and continue to have different kind of, again, insect populations changing, things like that will actually be a stress as well. This just happens to be, white nose, this fungus happens to be a huge pathogenic sort of effect. So that's something that is, from an epidemiological point of view, it's because of the way it's decimating things, and it has been, it's not even like recognized, it's not a native fungus. That's really of great alarm to people. But yeah, certainly behind it all, you compound that with habitat loss and climate change. And it's been a huge problem here, of course, in the Northeast, and now reaching out west. So I would agree with you. All of those things are big problems. Now, when it comes to mines and caves, you may see, and I don't know out west, but I know in Colorado, where some of the large hibernacula are, and Kentucky, really big cave systems. they actually have a lot of, regulations in place where if you go in, you have to decontaminate yourself. So it may be even, I remember I was in Arizona not too long ago, about 3 or 4 years ago, and there were actually, we wanted to go to the Karst caves, which is in, oh gosh, I forget what region of Arizona, but anyway, there were a lot of regulations on, if you go in, you have to take your shoes off, you have to dip in bleach, you have to do all these different things, gloves and that, trying to keep that fungus out. So you probably will see things like that if you do continue to go into caves. It's not that that's the only route of transmission. It just so happens that you're in that way, you might be affecting these places where bats will be hibernating over the winter. Does that make sense?
I see. Yeah.
But the spread out west is probably because of people. The fact that it got out into Oregon State is probably a result of people carrying the fungus.
So, one, are there species of bats that that migrate instead of hibernate?
Yes, there are. We've got, I mean, the ones I know, of course, are the ones in New Hampshire. And we have 8 different species of bats that are native to this state. Many of them, of course, are in different regions as well. But of those 8, just to give you an example, we have 3 species of bats that tend to migrate very long distance. So they'll be going from here in October-ish all the way out west. So, they come back around this time of the year, and they're actually living in trees mostly that are in this area. We also have some bats that stay here year-round and can live in buildings and around people. They're called synarthropic, so they actually can live with people pretty happily. And they will typically be hibernating all year round around here. Then we have a couple of different species that actually even go to caves. So they may go from here to Kentucky or those areas to find caves and mines. So I guess you'd consider them to be migratory as well.
Are any of those kind of evolved strategies, do any of them seem to make for like a more robust species than any other ones?
You know, actually, one of the things that has been said is that the big brown bat, which is now our most common bat, it is a synarthropic bat, so it actually lives, it's the one that if you see people that have them in their attics or their basements, and they're like, oh my God, it's a bat. It's usually a big brown bat. And because they live with people so well, it is theorized that they actually will have a little bit more resistance, and they usually, again, a little more adaptable in the sort of habitats that we have. So that is very possible. Little brown bats, which is the most hardest hit by this particular fungus, will also somewhat be around people, but they prefer to be a little bit farther away from them. So they'll actually be more, again, more resistant. They're not likely to be in your attics and your basements per se, and they've been hit the hardest. So the other ones that really have been hit hard include some of the migratory species that tend to go and then encounter bats from other areas. So they're sort of, again, getting this exposure from other bats coming from different places. And yeah, that may just lead to them being more susceptible over time. I wouldn't argue at that point. Yeah.
So more on some 101 stuff. Why the heck do we even need bats in the first place? Why do we care if we give them a fungus and 99% of the population goes extinct?
I know,
how's that influence my day-to-day life?
You know, it's funny, but I think, you know, talking about bats so much, and I love them so much, and I still am surprised that there's a lot of people that don't love them. I'm really startled by that because they're so great, they're so wonderful. No, but seriously, they are very important for a lot of really good reasons. There are, I think, if you run into estimates of maybe it's around $5 billion, that's with a B, of protection that bats give us to our agricultural crops every year. So if you take away bats and their ability to eat, they eat up to 50% of their own body weight every night. And that translates into thousands of insects every night. So that can be mosquitoes, but also the kind of pests that that will come into crops and decimate corn, potatoes, apples, all those things that we love. Bats are actually out there protecting quite a lot from those kind of pests and their invasions. So the more we have bats around, the better it is for us in terms of the food we can get, and also protection from, of course, the things that bite us. So mosquitoes, bats are very famous for eating all mosquitoes, which is very true. When you have bats around, you'll have a lot less of those problems in general. Yeah.
How how specialized are I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of variance in species, but how specialized are they in just what they eat? Are there bats that just only eat one particular
That's a
kind
good
of
question
insect?
too. You're right. There is a lot of variation among species. So with the bats that I'm talking about here, our New Hampshire bats are really kind of generalists. So these are all insectivorous, so they eat all kinds of insects. Many bats will show preferences for kinds of insects. So again, some will eat spiders, some eat moths, some will eat different kinds of, again, just winged insects, beetles, things like that. So you may find within species, and off the top of my head, I'm not sure with the bats here, but in general, they will eat a lot of different kinds of insects. When it comes to different species that eat, for example, nectar, frugivorous bats will eat nectar of different fruit flowers, flowers coming from fruit plants. Those can be highly specialized. So many of those bats are really adapted to eating only one kind of fruit from one kind of tree or plant. And just popping into my mind, out west, there's a bunch of bats that are very important in pollination for example, agave. If you don't know that agave is pollinated by the lesser long-nosed bat. So without that bat, agave flowers will not actually be able to reproduce either. In Asia and all over the world, many of the nectar eating bats will help pollinate in various ways. They're highly specialized. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I'd say, if you're talking about insects, there's usually a wide range. They'll eat anything that kind of is around them that can fly or move. Some bats, even out west, there's actually a kind of bat called the pallid bat that eats scorpions that actually, they land on the ground and they actually crawl towards, they can actually glean their food sources from the ground, which is very interesting. There are even bats that eat fish. So they can be very specialized in that way too. So around
Bats
the world,
eat fish.
there's a fish-eating bat. There sure is. Swoops over the water and scoops out a fish. Now,
What are we talking, like a little minnow or something? How big's this bat?
Yeah, like that, fish and frogs. And that's an Asian bat. So, again, highly specialized over there, which is kind of interesting. So actually 1/5 of all mammals in the world are bats. So that's 20% of every mammal.
Wow.
So bats are among the most numerous animals in the entire world. Yeah, they're pretty amazing. They really are.
So what does that mean in terms of so when we lose a given bat species and 97% of it is decimated, what does that mean for like a given region? I mean, I guess it's so impossible to say exactly what all of the downstream impacts would be.
Unfortunately, it is hard to say. And one of the things that, of course, New England is looking at now is our most specious bat, the little brown bat, is now the least so populous here. So everybody's trying to see, will this bat recover? Where is it going to be if it does recover, where will it go? Because of course the ecological niche that was filled by that one species is now being sort of again taken over by different bat species that will actually begin to really be successful in a different area. So it might make it even harder for that one species to come back, although there are signs that recovery is happening, which is good. Still, it's going to be really slow. It'll be centuries before you ever see the numbers that were once here. So the question becomes, what were those bats eating and what kind of impact did they have on their habitat? Those are all the questions people are trying to answer now, trying to predict what will happen next.
So are bats mostly just each species carving out its own niche in each environment, or is there a fair amount of competition within bat species themselves?
That's a good question. I would say that probably, again, there is competition for resources depending on where you are. So a lot of these tree bats and the bats like the big brown bats and things eat the same foods, but they exist in different sort of areas and locations will have more or less of those particular species. So I'd say that probably competition is important, just in the kind of roosts they can find, in the kind of the food sources there are. And so, yeah, again, that's a good question, but I'd say it's a good interplay of both.
Do you know much about like the deep evolutionary history of bats? I've had one or two people on talking about the evolution of flight and how flight's evolved in a few different ways, a few different times around the world throughout throughout the history of the earth, and sometimes things had like these almost like capes on their arms to like be able to tackle predators more. And then, hey, what do you know, you can flap these things around and fly a little bit too. And then feathers evolved maybe for warmth, and then hey, this, and then other things like you know, a lizard or whatever will have these little things that help it glide. And then okay, clever.
You know, I only know a little bit about those things. I mean, I teach zoology, which is all about the changes of animal bodies over time. And I know something about, again, the origin of bird and bird wings, and how the bones of bird wings, of course, are analogous to our hands. So are bat bones. So it's the same group of animals that originally were radiated out and then formed these structures. So again, the bat wing, there is a thumb, and then they have the fingers, and then the stretching of that wing comes down across into the body. So it's the exact same formation, which means it must have happened a long, long time ago. There are two really big groups of bats, the 𝕊𝕆𝐴𝐴 and the 𝕊𝕆𝐴𝐴. So the 𝕊𝕆𝐴𝐴 are the big flying foxes that you may know of in Australia. Their wingspans can be up to, gosh, 3-4 feet long. So they're huge. And then you have the 𝕊𝕆𝐴𝐴, which are little tiny bats like the ones we're talking about right now. Their wingspans are only about this long, you know, that long. So, so those two big groups of animals must have, you know, developed the ability to fly many, many, many millions of years ago. So interestingly as well, birds and the evolution of birds came down through reptiles, as you may know. And the egg laying and that sort of, again, group of animals would have been completely different from mammals, which these are. So again, there was a great divergence somewhere between reptiles and mammals. So again, that's a big area that I'd have to look up a little bit to know some more about dates and things like that. But yeah, there's a lot of convergence that happened many, many millions of years ago. That's about the best I can do. I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but I know something about sort of patterns. That's about it.
Are there places on Earth where bats don't exist? I imagine the poles.
Poles are really the only places. Every other continent has bats.
Okay.
Every other continent. So Australia and New Zealand, those areas are the only places you'll really find the large bats, the 𝕊𝕆𝐴𝐴, which are the flying foxes. They're actually the ones that look, well, they look like foxes. They're huge. Their bodies are really large.
I've been to Australia. I've been to yeah, in Sydney near the bay, or kind of near the Sydney Opera House there, you know, in the trees. They have the huge, my timing was right one time.
Oh, I would love to see them. I've never seen them. So that's so amazing. Wow. I would love to someday.
I can't believe you have. It's one of the most fantastic bat sightings I've seen.
Cool.
I lived in Austin, so I would get to see.
So you know
the
Bracken
famous
Bracken Cave. Yeah.
Well, and then the bridge is what I was.
Oh, the Austin Street Bridge, of course. So two very famous. I grew up in San Antonio.
What's the cave?
Bracken Cave. So Bracken Cave is, it's B-R-A-C-K-E-N, Bracken, and it is out between Austin in the Hill Country area. It's actually the largest collection of hibernating mammals in North America. So I think there's upwards of 20 million, I forget how many bats. They're Mexican free-tailed bats, which is a particular kind that has a tail not attached to the body, but it's actually just looks like a little rat tail. And you can go there now. It actually has been bought by a conservation organization that I love called Bat Conservation International, BCI. BCI is actually headquartered in Austin, Texas. They actually monitor that bridge, which is also Mexican free-tail bats. And so now Austin is amazing. So I grew up in San Antonio. I've been to Bracken Cave and the whole deal. And it is really incredible down there to see how many people love bats. See, this place is where people love bats.
Yeah, well, let's say you're not going to have a very hard time finding a bat shirt for yourself in
You are not kidding. I know. And Bracken Cave is beautiful. It actually has like a natural amphitheater. And you sit there at night and watch the emergence, and they just come out over your head. Oh man, for hours. They just come streaming out of this cave. It is really cool. So now that was threatened for a while by construction and people wanting to build houses out there because the hill country is beautiful. but BCI has bought that, and now it is a preserve, which is really awesome. So and that like I mentioned before, is one of the reasons why people are very afraid of this fungus getting down into Texas, because that is one of the largest hibernacula in the entire North American region.
Well,
It's there.
I mean, I mentioned that I went caving while I was before I was aware of this, the possibility that that could be a negative. Should people just not cave?
That's a good question. I would say do it carefully. I would say that if you go someplace where there are actually posted signs or people saying don't go in this entrance, or use these kind of regulations, just be sure you follow them as carefully as possible, because people really we don't know how how far this thing may be carried. Obviously, having it show up in Oregon State, which was about 2 years ago, I think, that was really a great concern, because the only way it could have gotten there is people carrying it. So if you're just careful about what you do and never sort of, again, caving is one of those things. I've never done it. It seems kind of crazy to me, but if you do it for fun, as long as you're, I guess paying attention to the fact that you may have other creatures in there, and being aware of them would be one thing, I'd say. I do know that in places where there's a lot of vulnerability, they're actually using what's called a heart trap that actually might even like cut off a cave entrance altogether, and that might keep people out a little bit. So they do that sometimes.
How much? I'm thinking back to when you said that. Well, I have a couple questions. One, when you have something like a small, small brown bats that are endangered or something, what are the steps that someone does to protect an endangered bat? I mean, it seems like with a really large mammal, it seems a little more straightforward in terms of like, okay, we gotta keep poachers out of here so that they aren't getting at rhino. It seems like bringing back bats is a bit more complicated.
It is, and especially when you're talking about they're so little that it's very hard to recognize them. Even in flight, it's very difficult. And if you have one in your house, how are you going to know if it's an endangered species or not? So those are big questions people have with little brown bats. And big brown bats. Big brown bats are pretty common, living in people's houses, buildings all over the place. Little brown bats are not, and they're the ones that are getting decimated by this fungus. So to tell them apart, it's extremely difficult. The big brown bat it weighs about as much as about 6 pennies in your hand, while the little brown bat weighs about 3 pennies worth in your hand. So, I mean, it's really just a small difference. How are you ever going to know? Well, that's one of the things that people say about, should you find a bat in your house? Should you find a bat on the ground? Anything like that? Don't try and do anything yourself. This is a case where you should actually call somebody who's able to identify them and help them rehabilitate them or whatever, or exclude them sometimes from, buildings in the right way, and not try to do it yourself. There is one bat here in the Northeast called the northern long-eared bat that was listed as federally threatened, or was it? I think it was threatened, or it might have been endangered. I forget what it was. Anyway, they did list it, so the state petitioned to have it listed. It's actually a tree-dwelling bat. And so they listed it, and everybody went, oh my gosh, so that means we can't cut down trees and build our houses, and how are we going to do this? We can't tell if it's even there. So there's a huge amount of public outcry about that because it's so hard to tell if they're there in the first place. And it caused a lot of problems with businesses and sort of the clashes between how you regulate these things and who can know this sort of information. So there are a lot of difficulties like that you find with land ownership and with how you identify bats. Can be really, really tricky. That's one reason why people that know bats well, it's important to know in your area who you could contact to come and help you if you have a problem with bats, not try to do it yourself.
So if you have a situation like you talked about where you have a small brown bats decreasing in population size, and in some ways this is creating some opportunity for other bat species that now the insects are a bit more abundant in a given area or something, and these other species thrive. So um, how much does that negate the issue of losing a particular species, and then what is the kind of importance of if someone were to say, well, so if we lose brown bats, if other species just end up thriving and eating all the insects, what's the difference?
Well, you could actually say that sort of nature is going to fill a vacuum. It's not, again, you'll have those species taking over in cases, like that. And I guess, that's an interesting sort of management question.
Mm-hmm.
Is it better for us to just sort of leave everything alone and let it take its course? Or is it better to try to mitigate whatever damages may have been actually human caused? And that is really an ethical question that I think is important to ask, and people will probably answer it in different ways. My opinion is that if it's something that's human caused, then we have sort of an obligation to try to do what we can to at least try to restore what might have been lost, because we don't know all the different ways that these species interact with each other, impact the environment. We have no way of telling that. So if there's anything we can do that might help to bring back those things that perhaps we have damaged and lost, I would say it's worth doing that. Some people might just say, let's just leave them alone, because they ultimately, you're going to have something filling in, again, the gap. But I think it's important that we try. That's my opinion on it ethically. But
now, bats are a very social species. One of the more social species on Earth. I mean, humans, I think humans, we take it for granted being as social as we are, but it's actually fairly rare to look out throughout the animal kingdom and see that many species anywhere near as social as we are.
yeah.
Bats are this very social species. They live in a lot of close quarters. They kind of have their own little cities, little Gotham cities in each cave, and then they also have to deal with the spread of contagion and epidemics on their own scales. How do bats react to the reason? I mean, I think one of the reasons why I thought to reach out to you was because I had a biologist mentioning the white nose fungus and talking about some species that seemed to have started picking up on distancing, not so much picking up on as probably what's actually happening is the individuals that happen to distance more and have that trait are surviving and thriving a little bit more and are leaving more offspring that also have that trait. And to their future generations. Bats having shorter generations happen to evolve a little faster, and maybe we're able to see it in a little faster of a scale than we are something like human evolution. So what can we learn from bats kind of regarding how they either manage or not just evolve, but maybe they have their own kind of threat detections for when they notice other individuals that are sick?
Well, a couple of things just jumped to my mind. So I just wanted to tell you just a couple things about the lifespan of bats and the reproductive rate of bats so that you know. And secondly, I just read something the other day about a study that was done, about how bats might be avoiding some of the white nose contagion. So actually, bats, first of all, the small bats, the 𝕊𝕙𝕗𝒃, which is all the bats that we have in this area, the insectivorous bats, these little ones, they can live for 20 to 30 years.
Oh, wow. I guess I didn't realize that.
So they're very long-lived. They actually are kind of evolutionarily sort of backwards. So they unlike a mouse. Well,
let's forget everything that I said then.
No. I just want to say they're actually, it's interesting because they work on this really, really slow time frame, and in addition to that, every year a female may give birth to one pup, maybe. So that's a really low reproductive rate over a long time. So actually the way that they withstand these kind of diseases and things can be very different from some other kinds of animals, like you may be thinking rodents and things like that. They're not like rodents at all in that way. So there's that. And secondly, the study that I just read was very interesting. In some caves, it is theorized, and some people have been observing caves now for some time in hibernacula to see how are bats surviving, are they surviving, what types of bats are surviving. One of the things they noticed, and this was just one study that was done, was basically saying that bats have learned to wake up either together when they kind of get covered in this fungus and they're all sort of starting to wake up. They either wake up together and they begin to then sort of forage for food, and they might find that to be a successful strategy. And sometimes they actually wake up at different times. So they're kind of distancing themselves, and which type of bats are going to succeed is one of the things that people are sort of looking at right now. So yeah, social distancing. Bats, when they hibernate, are very close together. It's actually, their body temperatures are kept very high by that. They're passing things amongst themselves, many thousands of them. And so it's a really interesting survival strategy for them. It also is one of the reasons why people think viruses actually can live in bat populations. Unlike us, there's something about the way that they cluster together and the way that their temperature is actually maintained, that they think bats, for that reason, will become actually really good virus sort of reservoirs, as we've now seen with coronavirus, possibly. So other things like that. So anyway, yeah, I guess back to that whole question about how they manage and how they sort of find ways to strategize. Well, it's all about selection, isn't it? So again, you're going to have this particular fungal pathogen, or in human cases, you know, viruses and things like that are actually going to select for those individuals that are going to be able to survive. And whatever the adaptation strategy is, that's what's going to become the most prevalent amongst these different populations. In fact, up here in the Northeast, there are studies now showing that some little brown bats, the ones that have been totally wiped out, some of them are hanging around. Some of them are now found in a particular hibernacula in the Northeast, and they're actually rebounding a little bit. Why? Well, they're looking at all kinds of different things. Is it something in their genome? There's actually a really neat study going on with different parts of the genome, actually looking at what is being conserved through bat populations being passed down, and are these little bits of genetic information what's giving them resistance as opposed to some others? Okay, those are all questions that are going to be answered, I guess, by more studies being done. But in fact, you're right. It could be behavioral. It could be genetic. It could be, you know, something having to do with the immune systems, things like that, that are conferring resistance on these bats, some more than others. We're just going to need more time to figure out if we can decipher what it is. And then humans do the same thing. So again, behavioral adaptations happen all the time. We're sort of being forced to do it now, you know, in a way to prevent the spread of the virus. But in the end, you know, again, we're seeing vulnerable populations being more affected than some others. It's the very same thing, whether you're dealing with fungal infections in bats, viral infections in humans, or even, you know, well, you name it, any other kind of pathogen. Yeah.
Do you happen to know if do bats have some of the same issues with aging, where maybe the younger ones might be more susceptible to one thing, the older ones might be more susceptible to another thing? And then there's like a prime of their life or whatever, where
there are definitely prime, there are prime years, reproductive years that are more, you know, again, where they're going to be more robust, and that may actually be something. I do think that younger bats are typically more susceptible for whatever reason, I'm not sure. But yeah, there's definitely something to the aging process that just like us may actually affect. I think that just has to do with the immune system overall.
I love mating behavior. How do bats get funky? Let's talk about some bat porn.
Well, actually, in the Northeast, in particular, I do think that one of the reasons why we have all the stories about bats at Halloween is because around October, when everything's getting cold and you have the full moon and everything, you'll actually find outside of hibernacula, bats will swarm. So they will actually be in the air, just swooping around, and they're actually mating in the air. They do it at that time of the year, and then they go into hibernation. So the females are pregnant, but then they have what's called delayed implantation. So they delayed fertilization or whatever. They actually hibernate throughout the year pregnant, and then emerge in the spring to have their babies. So that's actually their reproductive cycle every year. And yeah, this is the time, that's the time of year rather that bats will actually do that, mating on the wing. Yeah. Around here. So in the West, you can have different kinds of species, but that's what
it seems. Is it kind of? It seems like the. Have you ever seen the videos of like the fighter jets like refueling?
Yeah, exactly.
Is that sort of like?
That is kind of what it's like. Yeah, it must be a very quick process. I actually don't know much about that other than that. So that's pretty funny, isn't it? So, and speaking of being social, so in the summertime months, male bats will tend to be more solitary. They live in trees, they'll go and do their own things. So they tend not to be as social, while the females get together in these huge maternity colonies, and they live in the thousands. So that is a very interesting sort of social strategy that they have. So
wait,
male bats typically, male bats will oftentimes be much more solitary. You can find little congregations of males that may be together, maybe for protection or for foraging, but in general they're much smaller groups than the large maternity. Those maternity colonies are all females.
Then I guess there's not the it's just occurring to me. So bats probably don't have pair bonding as much. Because
they don't, not nearly as much, no. So,
they're because they're living in colonies, whereas like birds aren't living in colonies as much. And then there's the so is there more of a communal in terms of raising their young? I remember, I mean, that's one of my favorite studies about altruism, of the injecting. It's also one of the worst things. That's a real sad study too.
I've read things like that.
But the injecting the air into that, what is it, the vampire bats that so well, I'll just say it the way that I can recall it, and then you can correct me, or maybe you don't know, but it's, I believe vampire bats, they're able to collect a bunch of blood in their I think the scientific term is blood collection pouch neck.
It's like a crop.
And they go back and they often, it's often kind of a communal feeding for the young, and that way if one mom can't come back with blood one day, comes up short on a hunt one day, like the other mom, and then
heard of this, but I don't know as much about it.
And so there's a bit of altruism going on in there, making sure that like I'm bringing back the blood one day. Hopefully you, when I come up short, you're feeding my young the other day. And then there's actually to keep this in check, there's all of these kind of social pressures. And so they've tested this by, they'll have a mom that didn't get blood, and they inject her her blood pouch sort of thingamajig with air to make it look full to the other bats. And then when she doesn't have blood to give, but it looks like she has blood to give, and the other bats see her not feeding their young.
What happens then?
And then they retaliate by not feeding her young.
Interesting. See, I've not read that. You should send me that paper, because that sounds really interesting. I did not know that. Now, all I can tell you is that in the maternity colonies here, female bats can recognize their own young. Typically, when they go out and they're getting insects at night, if it is a mother bat, the baby is actually attached to their abdomen, so they're flying around with the baby. Some bats will leave the babies on branches, like red bats will leave the babies and then come back to them, and then bring them to the roost. Then coming into the roost, they actually can recognize by smell and sound their own babies out of these thousands. So they're really attached in that maternal way, while at the same time getting a lot of the benefit of having that communal relationship, because all the bats there are going to be, now keep in mind, again, they're feeding their babies as they're catching these insects. So, again, there's that, and they're nursing. So the babies are usually, again, suckling at that time. And then when they become volant, which means being able to fly, that happens around late June, early July, then they're out feeding on their own. So that makes sense. So they're not like birds and feeding like what they're eating. They're actually just getting the energy to make milk is what they're doing. So,
so there's a few different strategies out there.
Yeah, a couple of different things, but they're all, again, maintaining protection from different kinds of predators and things by having this large group, and also again utilizing all the resources in that area. But the only time they have those babies would be as they're drinking milk. Yeah, and then they fly off.
So it's the common understanding is that bats are flying around with sonar. Why do they have eyes?
Echolocation is actually one of the main ways they can identify where insects are flying in the air. But actually the big flying foxes that you saw in Australia don't use echolocation. They only use their eyes. And the bats here actually have pretty good eyesight, even though, you know, it's kind of like blind as a bat. That's a myth. They actually can see as well. And sometimes, particularly, you know, again, early in the evening and things like that, they can see well enough to sort of be able to also know what's in their surroundings and what they can eat. The bats that are, again, can even land on the ground will use echolocation just to determine distance. But then, you know, getting up close, they can use a combination of sight and echolocation to kind of be able to focus in on their prey. Echolocation is really just for directional signals, sort of knowing which direction to be heading in. But they can see. They can see. And they can see you if you come towards them in their hibernacula, things like that. They can definitely tell what is in their environment, which is interesting. Yeah.
So this is maybe the question that some listeners have been waiting for this whole time. Better get to it before we wrap up. I mean, I like a variety of foods. I love trying new things. I think people are very like judgmental about that. You know, I think people will be, you know, I've had episodes talking about, you know, some cultures that eat a bunch of insects and stuff like that are like really good for protein, and there's all these fantastic benefits to eating insects, but just because we haven't grown up that way, we go, whoa, insects.
It's a cultural thing.
But I'm sure if like some disease was like traced back to an insect that someone ate, we'd be like, I can't believe people are eating insects. What's wrong with these people? Where it would actually be good to eat insects. So knowing this, I can't tell if I should be eating bats or not. I mean, I'm a little curious.
There's a couple of things. So I'm certainly connected to a lot of these different bat organizations that I'm reading from people who are studying where this coronavirus has come from. And I do want to just say that even though bats are implicated in all of this, they're not necessarily the only ones carrying these viruses. Bats, unfortunately, are able to harbor viruses a lot more readily than many other kinds of animals for the reasons I mentioned before. Their immune systems simply are able to decimate viruses, their temperatures, something about the way they roost and the way there's a lot of things that viruses viruses actually live within them. It's called endemic. So they're living in bat populations, but not causing the bats any sicknesses. The
bats are just the vectors.
Exactly. They're called reservoirs. They're called reservoirs. Okay. So the bats are living with these viruses and have been for millions of years probably, and have evolved. They evolved to live together without causing dangerous symptoms to the bats or to any other animals, because you know pangolins have been implicated. There's civet cats. There's a lot of other animals that actually carry viruses. The problem is the virus then comes into a human body and says, oh, this is a perfect host, and now I shall. Then there's what we call a spillover, and in that moment we have the virus beginning to take over a new host, and it's just decimating us because, again, there hasn't been that long evolutionary sort of ability to live together and create evolution towards mildness. They say that viruses typically are going to evolve towards mildness because they don't want to kill their hosts. Viruses that kill their hosts off immediately have nowhere to go.
Right.
So it's like, you know, again, many kinds of viruses like the common cold is also a coronavirus and has been living with us endemically for a very long time, you could say, because we all probably carry little bits and pieces of it, but it's not causing us any major symptoms. This virus is a brand new one to us. And over time, the theory is that it will become more mild. It's actually going to find a way to live within us without causing a whole lot of major damage. So what we're seeing now is major damage coming from, they think, a bat source. And so the cultural traditions around eating bats are things that we probably don't understand. My concern is you have a lot of animals that may be consumed in different cultures and are part of traditions that represent sort of, again, either dietary tastes or maybe, you know, again, celebrations or whatever. Those things we can't really know about. The problems come when people are eating animals because there's nothing else to eat. And in that case, you have people going into populations of animals and sort of like taking from the wild. It's called bushmeat. And taking bushmeat from the wild can mean that you're eating something that is a whole new, again, reservoir for something that is unknown. And then boom, it's kind of like Ebola. It was also theorized that bats in Ghana in Western Africa were probably one of the reasons why Ebola in 2016 or whatever it was took off, because that was bushmeat. That was meat that people just had nothing else to eat and they had to go there. So there's a
yeah. I mean, I would certainly be fine if no human ever ate a bat ever again.
Me too.
But
I would too.
I mean, but at the same time, like some people's it's like, well, if we find that cats can carry corona, no one's sitting there going, we need to stop domesticating cats and get rid of all of our cats and euthanize all of our cats.
But when it's a bat,
might very well be a much bigger threat than the probability of someone actually eating a bat.
And unfortunately, bats are probably one of the most misunderstood and feared animals in the world. So what we're getting now is people going out and retaliating by just destroying populations of bats all over the place. Different countries are now going out and culling bats.
Really?
I've read about it in South America. I've read about it in Australia. I've read about it. People that are afraid and they go out and they destroy bat populations just thinking, oh, we'll get rid of the coronavirus because this is the way we're going to do it. That's not actually the way to do it. So it's really...
People are unstoppable.
Well, you know, when Ebola happened in Western Africa, that's what happened to a lot of bats out there. People would just killed them off. So that's unfortunate given the reproductive rate and all of, you know, the things we know about bats and how good they are. So
well, the
get
things
a lot of
that
misunderstanding.
Some people know about that. The things that a small minority of the human population knows about bats.
And I would say, you know, one of the best ways to prevent this kind of a spillover event is just give people enough food that they don't have to go into these unknown areas and sort of go deeper and deeper into, you know, parts that have not really been, you know, again, exploited before. That's really what needs to happen. And leave bat populations alone if possible. So.
Well, how much of it is just that it's a delicacy? Like,
that may be. Well, that's what I mean. Is like there's the cultural things about it, which that may be harder to address and maybe you won't change that. But I would say that in general, if it's a cultural taste, there are a lot of places where that may be, eating bats may just be part of sort of the accepted. Well, if that's the case, then usually they're doing that sustainably. They usually aren't going to places that are sort of, again, brand new. And that's the place where you'll have these spillover events happening. But in general, cultural beliefs are much harder to change. So I don't know how, you know, how to address that is only through education and helping people understand, you know, again, why it might be not a good idea to eat an animal that is potentially a virus reservoir, which hopefully they're trying to do. And this pangolins were also somewhat in the story here, and many other animals in particularly Southeast Asia in that area are carriers of viruses as well. So it's just a matter of how many animals are being taken from the wild and how many could be sustainably again consumed if populations really wanted that to be. That's harder to change. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I'm hoping that we created some new Batmen and women.
That's awesome.
through this. Got a couple questions as we're wrapping up. One, what can people think about and do, or major takeaways you'd hope that people have, and then also if there's like a good bat book or documentary or something like that.
Okay. Well, I think one of the major takeaways I would love for people to think of, the next time you see a bat or you hear about a bat or you know, again, read about a bat or there's movies with bats, is think about the fact that a lot of the things that you believe about bats are actually not true. There's a lot of myths and a lot of misunderstanding about this very, very important group of animals. And the reality is that bats are extremely docile. They're gentle. They're really helpful in so many ways. And they're actually really beautiful little animals if you get to see them up close. So I would say that, again, overall, the most important thing I would hope people would do is think before you just indiscriminately kill bats. So like, get some help, get some people who can help you figure out if a bat is in your house. Don't just swat it down and kill it. They're actually very fragile, you know, beautiful little creatures. And I would hope that people might just take another look. In doing that, there's a lot of good things online. So when you read or hear about bats, one of the places you could go online to check it out would be Bat Conservation International. It is an incredible resource, and that's the one that's based in Austin, Texas. They do so much to promote the understanding of bats and just how amazing bats really are. So you could just look them up online and maybe read about, oh, I don't know, take a trip to Bracken Cave, or, you know, like have a chance to actually think about these very misunderstood little animals.
Amazing. Well, that was terrific.
Well, I think we covered a lot of ground. There's
yeah.
So much that, you know, again, many people are studying in so many ways, and I only know little bits and pieces of it, but it is really, really important that everybody, hopefully, will appreciate bats.
Yeah,
very,
I hope
very
so
cool.
as well. Well, thank you, Katharine York, for joining me.
That's
and thank you, listeners, for being such wonderful, curious people. We'll talk with you next episode.
Okay.
Are we?
Yes.
Where are we?
Here.
Why are we here? Not entirely clear. We are misfits thrust into existence by random chance, with no hints at all as to how we're supposed to make sense of it all. It's immensely bizarre. Here we are.